You're listening to an Ono Media podcast.
Good morning, and thanks for joining me for Rise in Crime, your morning caffeine hit all about crime. I'm Mama Jules, and death row inmate out of Ohio has been released pending a new trial, and it's all due to DNA testing. All right, we got to head back to August 3rd of 1988 when Amanda Mayer and her boyfriend Glenn Smith went to the Five Points Tavern in Xenia, Ohio. The two, along with their infant daughter Sarah, had been out house hunting, and they're exhausted. So they stopped in for a few drinks, and then they left the bar at about 7:30 p.m. to visit the Greene County Fair. After a couple of hours there, the two returned to the bar at about 9:45 that night. They hung out, shooting some pool and having a couple of drinks again. And then about an hour after the couple had returned to the Five Points, David Myers showed up at the bar. He kind of got friendly with Glenn, and the two began shooting pool and drinking together. And this makes sense because Glenn kind of knows most of the regulars. He moonlights as a weekend bartender, so when David shows up to burn some time, Glenn's familiar with him. As happens when alcohol gets involved sometimes, David makes a possibly unwanted and miscalculated comment about Glenn's girlfriend, Amanda. See, Amanda is wearing a Mickey Mouse shirt, and the ears of Mickey are resting directly over her breasts. David says to Glenn that he wants to play with Mickey's ears. Now, presumably because of where they're positioned on the shirt is why he says it. And Glenn isn't all that pleased, and he basically tells David to shut the heck up. So smartly, Glenn takes a leave from the bar. He goes and gets some breath outside, calms down, gets some fresh air. He's gone for about 15 minutes, and when he returns, he's just a little bit more level-headed, and the two men begin shooting pool together again, and they're still drinking. At about midnight, Amanda and Glenn decide they're finished with their night at the Five Points bar. So they head on over to the Round Table bar just a few blocks away. Well, David asks if he can join them, and the three jump in Glenn's car and they drive to the Round Table. When they arrive, Amanda is sort of dismissed. Like maybe she's been told, hey, honey, head on into the bar while me and David have a chat. And once Amanda is out of earshot, Glenn decides he needs to let David know a thing or two. It seems David hasn't quit making sexual innuendo remarks about Amanda. Well, after the back and forth between the two men, the dust apparently has been settled, and the men start drinking whiskey slammers together at that bar. Well, at this point, Glenn's pretty inebriated, and his behavior is showing how drunk he actually is. Teresa, the bartender at the Round Table, well, she warns Glenn that if he doesn't control his actions, she's going to make him leave the bar. Okay, you're not going to be shocked to learn that Glenn loses his cool. And in a rage, he throws his drink to the floor, shattering the glass. So Teresa calls the cops. Two Xenia officers show up, and again, you're not going to be shocked that Glenn is belligerent with them as well. At 1:15 a.m., Glenn is cuffed and placed under arrest. And Amanda's pretty frantic at this point, but the two officers do their best to explain how the night will finish out for Glenn. And Amanda, understanding that Glenn won't be returning to the bar, well, she asks the officers if she could have Glenn's wallet and car keys. I'm sure she's just trying to settle out the bar tab and get herself home. Well, the two officers agree, and she retrieves the items from Glenn's pant pockets. As the officers are finishing up with the bar staff, Amanda tries those keys in Glenn's car, but none of them seem to start the vehicle. David is still lurking, and he assures one of the police officers that he will take responsibility for Amanda and get her back home. He's even gutsy enough to lean into the patrol vehicle and assure Glenn the same thing. He's going to take care of Amanda. Well, at this point, Glenn's taken to the police station and booked. One of the officers returns to his regular patrol duties, and Amanda and David head back into the Round Table in search of a different set of car keys. But they have no luck. Amanda then asks Teresa, the bartender, if she can borrow a flashlight to check the parking lot for keys. Bar patrons had noticed that David had become quite cozy with Amanda. His arm is around her waist while he was helping her search for the keys. One particular patron named Charles was standing just outside of the bar watching the two search for keys in the parking lot. He later told officers that he eventually saw Amanda and David leave the parking lot on foot and head down a side street. Well, just moments after the two left the bar on foot, that same officer, the one who went back out on patrol following Glenn's arrest, well, he sees David and Amanda walking down the street, and he doesn't think anything of it because David had promised he would get Amanda home. And at this point, walking is probably much safer than driving because of how much these two have drank over the last few hours. Okay, all of this is happening at about 1:30 in the morning. It's 1988. We don't have cameras. We don't have cell phones. We only have eyewitnesses. And at 2:10 a.m., about 40 minutes after David and Amanda are spotted walking on the street, a man says he sees David alone getting into his car at the 5 Points Tavern. All right, that's the original bar. 5 minutes later, David drifts back into the Round Table bar, so that's the second bar, and he orders a drink from Teresa. As she's preparing his beverage, David heads into the restroom where he stays for several minutes before returning to the bar to nurse his drink. At this time, the bar is nearly empty. Almost everyone is gone at this point, and it's getting late. But one patron who had witnessed the whole Glenn breaking the glass and getting arrested fiasco, well, he approaches David and asks, "Did you get any action off of Amanda?" And David responds that he tried, but Amanda wasn't willing. He then claims he dropped her off. Now, he doesn't say where he dropped her off, just that he dropped her off. 45 minutes later, a new character enters into this story. Her name's Jennifer, and she was walking home from work when she literally stumbles upon a girl laying on the railroad tracks. The girl is barely breathing and nearly naked. The only item of clothing that remains on her body is her shirt, and it's bunched up around her neck. Jennifer runs to her home and calls the police. And a new officer, a different one, who wasn't involved in the Round Table bar arrest, he shows up on the scene and finds Amanda clutching to life with small moans emanating from her ravaged body. Then just moments later, the officer, who had returned to his patrol work following Glenn's arrest, he arrived on the scene as well, but he doesn't even recognize Amanda. She's so disfigured that he doesn't make the connection. As he kneels next to her, he suddenly realizes that a railroad spike has been shoved into her skull. EMTs rushed Amanda to the hospital, where she was then life-flighted to a trauma hospital. But during the flight, Amanda dies from her wound. Now, an autopsy on Amanda revealed that she had abrasions on her neck and her forehead, but ultimately she died from the spike to her skull. And I'm gonna spare you the details about her sexual assault, but items were found inside of her body, and the doctor believed those items were inserted after her death. All right, so it's obvious, right? They arrest David just hours after Amanda's body was found. That's the obvious connection here. When officers searched David's Mustang, they found Glenn's wallet and keys stuffed inside a man's glove under the front passenger seat. But it gets worse for David, because as he is being booked into the county jail, he tells the officer that, quote, "Cocaine will make you do anything. It will make you do anything to get it." Now, the next few years for David are full of legal back and forths. At first, he's indicted for aggravated murder, but investigators are still shoring up their case. While they work on that, they amend David's charges and they nail him with 11 counts of forgery from a previous crime they claim he committed. And those forgery charges assure that David will remain in prison with his guilty plea to those charges. And also nailing him with forgery assures more time for authorities to find evidence in Amanda's death. Well, months before David is to be released from prison, the prosecutor in Greene County refiles the aggravated murder charge. And finally, they bring David to trial in 1996. That's 8 years after Amanda's murder and 3 years after the second filing of charges. Now, during his trial, 2 different jailmates of David testified against him. One prisoner testified that David had warned him to never try to drive anything through another person's forehead, stating that it just won't go. He then allegedly said, "You can get something through somebody's temple, though." A witness did come forward in the trial claiming that David, back in 1986, okay, that's 2 years before Amanda's murder, well, that witness said David had offered her a ride home from a Xenia bar. She testified that David pulled off into a cemetery and raped her there before dropping her off at her dorm room. During the trial, an expert witness testified that the pubic hair found on Amanda during her post-death examination, that expert witness said that hair belonged to a Caucasian male, but that was as far as she could go with identifying who the hair belonged to. Then another expert said that the hair had no connection to David. And yet another expert testified that the DNA from the hair bore the same DQ alpha genotype as one of David's tested hairs. The expert then testified that only 2% of the population has that genotype. All right, so this DNA testimony is all over the place. During all the years leading up to the trial, David repeatedly said he had nothing to do with Amanda's murder, but he did not take the stand during his trial. Well, the jury ultimately found him guilty of aggravated murder, and they suggested that David be sentenced to death for his crime. But the judge disagreed and sentenced David to life in prison. Now, 28 years later, 60-year-old David Myers has been released from death row, and it all comes down to the DNA. See, back in 2020, a motion was filed to have that DNA that was found on the railroad spike and also on a nearby rock. Well, that motion asked for additional testing, and the motion was successful. So that DNA has now been re-examined. The test revealed that the DNA from the male contributor excluded David. His lawyer said the following about the findings. Because of this newly discovered exculpatory DNA evidence, and because his conviction and death sentence were based on false, misleading, and unreliable forensic science that has since been debunked by the scientific community, Mr. Myers deserves a fair, new trial where a jury can hear all of the evidence. Well, the judge agreed, and on Monday, David was released from prison on the condition that he wear a GPS monitor. He also is not allowed to leave the state, and he must stay clean. There's no alcohol or drugs as he awaits a new trial. And remember how I told you that Amanda and Glenn had an infant daughter at the time of her murder? Well, her name's Sarah, and she urged the judge to keep David locked up. She emotionally begged the judge by telling him that it just wasn't worth the risk, that she had already experienced a lifetime of emotional and psychological turmoil due to her mother's death. Why should she experience more? Now, prosecutors have doubled down on the case, vowing to appeal the judge's ruling and retry David for Amanda's murder. My search for Amanda's details, her life, her hobbies, it didn't turn up much. But we're not the only ones without information. Amanda's daughter Sarah told WHIO-TV that she only has a handful of pictures and newspaper clippings from her death to signify her mother's life. She said that people tell her she looks just like her mother when they see pictures of Amanda. She also is shocked she has now lived twice as long as her mother, who died at the very young age of 18. She also said she wrongly assumed she would ever even be in this position. She told the reporter that David's family is now more hopeful than they have ever been over the last 36 years, and she is the most lost she has been in the last 36 years. So what about Glenn? You guys, I found nothing. I looked for an obituary. I came up empty-handed. I looked through news articles. He is not quoted. He doesn't seem to be present at the most recent hearings. So if you're from Ohio and you know where Glenn is, let us know. And I'll keep you updated on David's new trial. All right, have you heard about the super yacht that sank off the coast of Sicily last week? Well, here's what happened. At about 5 a.m., a violent storm rolled through the coast of Italy. That storm created a tornado over the water just offshore, and those tornadoes are referred to as waterspouts. Well, on that morning, the 183-foot yacht named the Bellinian was anchored in the Palermo area. When the violent storm hit and created that waterspout, It ripped a hole in the boat's mast, causing the super yacht to lose balance and then sink. 22 people were on board, including 12 passengers and 10 crew members. 6 passengers were declared missing after the Italian Coast Guard conducted a rescue mission. And then one man, the cook on board the $18 million yacht, well, he was immediately declared deceased. For the next 36 hours, divers continued to search the waters for the missing 6 people. Experts were fearing the missing people were caught in the hull of the boat and died when the yacht sunk to the ocean floor. Well, early on Wednesday, 4 bodies were pulled from the wreckage. And at the time of the recording, authorities had not identified who those bodies are. Okay, all of this is such a tragedy. But this is a true crime podcast, so why am I covering this? Well, British tech entrepreneur Mike Lynch and his 18-year-old daughter, Hannah, are 2 of the 6 that were declared missing after the yacht sank. And the whole reason the 12 passengers were even on the super yacht was because Mike Lynch was celebrating his acquittal on fraud and conspiracy charges. Mike's legal saga began back in 2018 when he was indicted on several counts of securities fraud and conspiracy charges. The charges originated out of California and were leveled by federal prosecutors. This all stems back to 2011. That's when Mike Lynch, who's been referred to as the British Bill Gates, well, Mike attempted to sell his business software company named Autonomy. That sell was reported to be upwards of $11 billion. And the takeaway for Mike was $800 million. That's quite the haul. But here's where they thought Mike went wrong. Federal authorities say that he inflated the worth and revenues of Autonomy prior to the sale to Hewlett-Packard. The charges stemmed from Hewlett-Packard devaluing the company just 1 year after the sale. They claimed to investors that Mike had inflated the value of the company and that his team of workers had been mismanaging the company as well. So, those 2 factors led to Hewlett-Packard taking a massive loss just 1 year after purchase. Long story short, Mike was accused of cooking the books. Well, it took 13 years for the jury trial to finally take place in California, mostly due to Mike fighting extradition. When it did finally happen, Mike was extradited from the UK and held on house arrest in LA for more than 12 weeks. In the end, the tech entrepreneur was cleared of all 15 counts of fraud and conspiracy. And that in and of itself is kind of crazy in federal criminal cases. If the feds have enough paperwork on you to bring charges, they almost always get a guilty verdict. In 2022, only 0.4% of federal criminal cases led to a trial and then an eventual acquittal. But Mike's lawyers during the trial argued that he had nothing to do with the accounting department and therefore he could not be held responsible for the misinformation he was given in the cell. You fight federal charges for 13 years that could have landed you in prison for 20 years. You get acquitted 2 months ago, and then you charter a yacht for you and your daughter and 10 other friends. And then Mother Nature says, not so fast. Mike was not the only big name on board. Morgan Stanley International Chairman Jonathan Bloomer and prominent American lawyer Chris Morvillo are both reported among the missing, along with their wives. All other passengers and crew members have been released from the hospital. All right, you guys, you know what we should never underestimate? That's the power of the internet. Don't ever underestimate that power, because just 3 days ago, I brought you the viral story of legal heads at Disney claiming that a wrongful death lawsuit must be handled by arbitration because the man filing the lawsuit clicked yes to the terms of agreement on his Disney Plus subscription. But guess who has now voided that arbitration clause? That's right, Disney. But don't get your hopes up just yet. Okay, let's do a quick reminder of this case that I just covered in the last podcast. Dr. Knokpan Tongswan died in October of 2023, allegedly because her meal at Raglan Road Irish Pub and Restaurant that's located in Disney Springs in Orlando, well, they said that meal contained nuts and dairy. These are 2 things Knokpan was deathly allergic to. While dining at the pub, Knokpan and her husband, Jeffrey Piccolo, repeatedly asked the waitstaff and the restaurant manager if the food was truly allergen-free. They were reassured more than once that her meal would be safe to eat. But 1 hour after dining, Konakpan collapsed at the Planet Hollywood and died from asphyxiation. 5 months later, in February of this year, Jeffrey filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Disney asking for $50,000 in compensation for his wife's death. Well, in May, Disney responded with their own filing saying that the suit should not be settled in front of a jury trial and should instead be handled in arbitration because Jeffrey had agreed to an arbitration clause that is included in the terms of agreement on his Disney Plus subscription. That free subscription that Jeffrey kept active for 1 month and then canceled before he was going to be required to pay, yeah, that's the one that he clicked the box on. Well, after news of Disney's reaction was shared online, and many web users were outraged, Disney on Monday shifted gears. Here's a part of the statement they released. It reads, "At Disney, we strive to put humanity above all other considerations. With such unique circumstances as the ones in this case, we believe this situation warrants a sensitive approach to expedite a resolution for the family who have experienced such a painful loss. As such, we've decided to waive our right to arbitration and have the matter proceed in court." All right, so what happens now? Well, the parties, Disney and Jeffrey, they'll be left to discuss the facts of the case and how the law applies to those facts. Those facts include an autopsy that states Konakpan died from very high levels of nut and dairy allergens in her system. And another fact, Disney does not own the Raglan Road Irish pub. They only rent the real estate that the restaurant is housed on. However, Jeffrey believes that the relationship between Disney and Raglan Road Irish pub is implicitly stated by the restaurant being showcased on Disney World's website as allergen-free. Jeffrey's lawsuit claims that Disney takes a level of responsibility by offering that restaurant up as an allergen-sensitive dining option on their website. So, will they come to a settlement agreement? Who knows? Like I said on Monday, a jury might award way more than $50,000 in this case. But it's also important to note that the arbitration clause still exists. So if you click the terms of agreement on any Disney product, you are most likely held to the standard of arbitration instead of traditional courtroom cases. A court hearing on this case is slated for October 2nd. I'll keep you updated. And let's end with this airline nightmare that makes that chatty passenger in the seat next to you in economy seem not so bad. Because last weekend, 40-year-old Gosder Chiroulis of Wakefield, Massachusetts, was taking a flight out of Boston Logan Airport. Now, the former standout lineman from Boston College and a former NFL lineman, well, he was headed to Dublin, Ireland, along with a plane load of other passengers. But just minutes into the flight, the pilot contacted Boston Logan Air Traffic Control and requested to return to the airport due to an unruly passenger. After hearing about the disturbance on the airplane, Delta Airlines requested Massachusetts State Police to be ready to intercept the unruly passenger. So, what was going on during that transcontinental flight? Well, Gosder had taken some sleeping medication, and while a little blitzed, he urinated onto another passenger headed to Dublin. It's so gross. Upon arrival at Terminal E, State Police and Customs and Border Patrol, they went onto the aircraft to remove Gosder. Troopers commanded Gosder to leave the plane with the troopers, but instead, he became irate and uncooperative. After many words were exchanged, Gosder was forcefully removed and placed under arrest for disorderly conduct and also for disturbing a flight crew. When he was asked to place his hands behind his back in order to be cuffed, he refused, and he clenched his fists so that cuffs couldn't be used because they basically couldn't fit over the top of him. This guy's a former NFL player. He's 6'7" and he's a big dude. Well, 2 deputies struggled to restrain him, but they eventually were able to use 2 sets of handcuffs to control the athlete. Gosder was arraigned in East Boston District Court, and he immediately posted his $2,500 bail. Until his case is settled, he will not be allowed to travel out of that specific airport. Gosder did make a social media post in an effort to explain his behavior. He wrote the following: I would like to address the media reports about me that surfaced today regarding a situation that occurred on board a flight to Ireland this past weekend. The flight was unexpectedly delayed for approximately 4 hours, and it did not take off until after 12:30 a.m. In preparation for the unexpected overnight flight that I don't normally use, which resulted in behavior that is not representative of my character, and I would like to apologize to the passengers and flight crew. All right, I hope that's enough for the person who got peed on. I don't know. But you might recognize Gosder, who was the first-round draft pick in 2008 with the Detroit Lions. He then went on to play for the Indianapolis Colts and also the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. A flight delay and also getting peed on. That's one heck of a nightmare airline story. All right, that's your Thursday episode of Rise in Crime. Thanks for joining me here on this podcast or the YouTube broadcast, whichever way you're watching it or listening, because I love being a part of your day. I love just doing this. It's fun to share this with the listeners, and I'm so glad that you're enjoying the community. If you are, would you please share this show with a friend? I also love 5-star reviews and positive comments. It helps make the podcast grow, and leaving a comment on YouTube also helps the videos grow. You can join me again on Monday for more morning crime news. I'm Mama Jules, and keep safe out there.